Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast for the School of Politics and International Affairs at the University of Illinois Springfield. I am Craig McFarland, your host today. I'm an online coordinator at the College of Public Affairs and Education here at UIS. And so I am excited today to bring you the first of a series of episodes that we will discuss with our faculty. And so today I thought it would be very appropriate to start with the director of the school here as our first faculty member to be able to talk to, and that's Dr. Magic Wade. She has a lot of interest in state politics and state government and how those state policies can be used as sort of laboratories of democracy or incubators to be able to determine what might be best for community responses to major issues. One of those major issues is gun violence. And so you'll hear me talk to her quite a bit about her research in that area too. She's been at UIS since the 2015-2016 school year. And so she's been here for a while. And she's also going to talk in this conversation about some of the work that she's done with graduate students as well, and some of the opportunities that you might have here as a student within the School of Politics and International Affairs. So I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to Dr. Wade today. And with that, we'll just go straight to the interview with her. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk to Dr. Magic Wade, the director of the School of Politics and International Affairs here at the University of Illinois Springfield today. So, hi, Magic. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for doing this.
Of course. It's really great to be able to give our potential students and then also our current students and maybe alumni some perspective on the types of education that they get, the types of research interests that our faculty have in particular. I'm excited to talk to you first about this because we have such a great wealth of knowledge amongst the faculty in the program and a lot of really diverse research interests that you have as well amongst all of your colleagues. And so it's really great to be able to dive into this. And you being the director of the program will give us some good perspective on that too. So the big thing that I'd like to talk about first is just a little bit of your background and your bio. I know that you joined us here at UIS in the 2016 year, if I remember correctly. And so you've been here for a while, but can you talk about basically your background going into when you arrived here at UIS?
Sure. So I started the 2015-2016 school year. And prior to coming to UIS, I attended the University of Minnesota for my PhD. And then before that, I'm from the West Coast. So I grew up in Alaska, but then I did my undergrad and master's degree in Washington State. Then I moved to the Midwest for my PhD program, and I landed at UIS, which was really exciting because being in the state capital was relevant to my research interests because I was really studying state politics and public policy around the 50 states during my dissertation research and a lot of my early research as a political scientist.
That's so great. And now you know that the states are kind of incubators of ideas and different policies. And so that's got to be a varied shift going from Alaska, where you grew up to more of the West Coast. And I'm guessing more environmentally focused type of state legislation that's going on out there. And then coming over to the Midwest. What drew you to the PhD program at Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, there was faculty that were working specifically on the kind of public policy component from the comparative states perspective. And so a lot of political scientists, including political scientists at UIS, study comparative forms of government internationally. But I wanted to use the states because, like you say, they are these laboratories of democracy, but there's so much variation. So within one nation, you can get all these different political cultures and different sets of political interests and power. And growing up in Alaska, you're completely right. It is a very different environment. We are very far removed from a lot of the mainstream political debates and have really unique interests. And so coming from that experience, I wanted to go to a PhD program at Minnesota that enabled me to kind of harness the 50 states and their variation to try to explain political phenomena.
That is so cool. I'm going to geek out with you about that for a long time to come, I can tell. But it's great that you have such an interesting perspective on the states and that happens to be one of your focus areas. We're going to talk a bit about your research as well. But you recently became director of the School of Politics and International Affairs once it became we've kind of reorganized as a college and university, and that now that this school exists, you're sort of the first director of that school. What I want to talk about, though, as it relates to your role as director of the school, is how you function and work with your colleagues as well to help provide good curriculum for our students.
So one of the biggest differences between being just a general faculty member who spends most of their time teaching and doing research compared to being the director of a school that has 10 faculty members and then staff who also support us, is that I've shifted a lot of my focus toward trying to make sure that the faculty and the staff have everything that they need to be successful in being the ones who primarily interact with students. So now I still teach and I still work with students every semester, but there are more faculty who have that as their primary responsibility because I've shifted to these administrative tasks. So I'm kind of having to think at things at a higher level and be a liaison between all these different stakeholders. And so I communicate with faculty and staff a lot. Present students, but then also alumni and prospective students. And those are kind of my constituencies that I'm trying to think about. What are the things that they would need to know or what they would need to be more successful? And so that's really fun because I get to be the center of communication and bringing people together from all these different groups. And I really enjoy doing that.
That's so great. And, one of the benefits, I think, of going to a place like UIS is that because we're a small public university, we do have a lot of interest in faculty teaching. So we don't utilize necessarily a lot of TAs or graduate assistants in that way. But what we do is we have full-time tenured faculty that are able to talk to you about their specific research interests, and especially in an area like political science or global studies, where you have so many varied interests that go on. I mean, we have great faculty who we're going to get to hear from as this series goes on. But I think about like Dr. Gilman Opowski, who is focused more on political philosophy, where you have Dr. Pearson, that he focuses more on the civil side and the court side of things. You also have people that are interested in international relations like Dr. Aktay, and then also Dr. Nizamuddin and Dr. Crocker from the comparative perspective. So we get all of these different areas, and your particular interest has been more in the states and some topics and some areas of interest that have been going on here, particularly things around incarceration in the court system and the justice system. But then also, I know you wanted to spotlight some of your research and some of your emphasis on gun violence, which is, of course, a major issue that just continues to dominate our political landscape as well.
Sure, absolutely. And so bridging my interest in state politics, I also focus on local governments and communities. And one of the things that I do when I study gun violence is look at it from the community perspective. And so it is a national concern and an issue, but gun violence really manifests at the community level. And communities have really different kinds of, causes and exacerbating factors. They have different resources in addressing it. And so I became interested in gun violence a few years ago, just having observed it locally, both in Springfield and then I live in Champaign-Urbana. And I noticed this uptick that was coinciding with the pandemic. And I just noticed that by reading the local news. And I had been aware that prior to really around like the late 2010s, we were actually at historic lows for gun violence nationally. So 2014 in the United States was the year that had the least number of gun homicides on record in history. And so that was great. That was great news. And I was teaching urban politics in 2015 to 2017. And so we were really trying to understand, like, hey, this is a success story. This isn't usually what we talk about in political science, is something going right. And so, there's all these different explanations and theories for why gun violence had really declined and how cities were becoming safer. But then I see this start to change, and the conversation is really around, like, is this a spike? Is it temporary? Where's it happening? And then why? And so one of the things my research agenda focuses on is trying to get a shared sense of the scope and the severity of the problem of gun violence, looking at way more cities than most researchers are able to get data for. And so I work with gun violence archive data. This is open source data that actually reads, like, they get cases of gun homicides and assaults from news media and police reports. And they have them for, it's a huge comprehensive database. And then I'm able to focus on a lot more cities than typical research on gun violence that just looks at big cities like Chicago or Philadelphia or, Baltimore, and instead show that there's actually been increasing rates of gun violence in cities of all sizes across the U.S. And it's been going up for the past few years, but during the pandemic, it really spiked. And so now we're able to see, because it's 2023 now, where it's actually starting to get stabilized and go down, and also where it's still elevated. And then we can take cues, in these hot spots to say like, okay, this is where the gun violence problem isn't under control yet. And so studying these small and mid-sized cities really enables us to see it from a more broad perspective than just like always talking about the cities that have notoriously been historically violent. Because in reality, there are a lot more cities that like have gun violence that never used to, even as recent as like 10 years ago.
And so as a prospective student, someone that's interested in these types of policies, or maybe wanting to become an advocate for a certain cause or go and lobby for a particular piece of legislation, what is the relationship between the type of data that you're able to collect and to peruse and to be able to explain kind of that empirical or quantitative data, and how you then make some potential recommendations to policymakers or for potential pieces of legislation later on? What's the bridge how does that work?
Sure. So I'm really interested in community vulnerability and resilience to gun violence. And so, we've seen a national trend in heightened gun violence for various reasons. And so if we can identify the characteristics of cities that make them persistently vulnerable, but then also make them more resilient, then we can make recommendations to policymakers saying, here are the cities you should focus on. And then here are the aspects of, say, community development, public safety, and law enforcement, education, economic development. Here are the levers that you can pull to increase the resilience of a city. And in terms of working with students, I recently had a graduate student, BJ Reddle, and he helped me work collecting a whole bunch of data about the characteristics of the communities that we have the gun violence data for. And so he looked at demographic trends, he looked at population growth, poverty rates, unemployment rates, all these different factors at the community level. And he wrote his master's thesis exploring kind of the differences across these communities. And unsurprisingly, we really see that there are certain communities that even before the 2020 spike in gun violence, they were already experiencing elevated rates of gun violence. And it really coincides with like how many people are in poverty, how many people are unemployed, these kinds of vulnerable characteristics. At the same time, he also found that communities that typically have been more resistant to gun violence are also experiencing more. And so that's something that we can kind of identify and say, like, here are the things that we should watch for and focus on in terms of resources, like flooding resources into places. And this can mean all kinds of different things. It could be a public safety resource, an occupational resource, community-based resources. And these are the types of things that can help communities stop this in its tracks, because it's one of those things that cycles of gun violence really perpetuate each other, because a lot of them have to do with retaliation and longstanding disputes between different groups. And so if they don't get stopped early, they'll just continue to fester and continue to be a problem.
And it's interesting because what you're able to do is kind of use this information and come up with a more holistic look at the issue as a whole. And I want to get into the fact that you worked with a graduate student and sort of talk to people about the idea of how you can work with a direct faculty member like that. But before I do, I come at a lot of this when I was a student here, focusing things on political campaigns and elections in America. And of course, such a huge amount of political campaigning, a major issue, are the types of tug and pull that we have over things like the Second Amendment and like gun rights and gun violence, as well as a major political topic. And so that's an area where your research is also able to hopefully impact or affect, or at least be able to give some more information to the political psyche a bit of voters. I know that, speaking of your colleagues and faculty, we've got Dr. John Transu, who focuses things on public opinion and public perception and political psychology. And I just wonder how much, like, if you were to tell people back in 2014 that gun violence and gun homicides were actually at a low point in America, I don't know that the public perception was there for that, And so it almost seems like we are becoming so immune to school shootings or to gun violence that happens, mass shootings that happen in a way that isn't healthy as a society, but it's almost like we've brought it in as part of our public life, and that then filters into the political campaigns as well. I don't know if I have a question there, just kind of off the top of my head, sort of. Yeah.
So a really good observation. And this is something, my most research article that was published in Homicide Studies, and it's called Not as Bad as the 1990s, and there's a question mark. And that's really a response to news coverage of gun violence and how we contextualize it and how we talk about it based on the available data. And so, oftentimes we're looking at national trends, which can really obscure that there's so much variation at the local level. There are some communities that have no shootings. There are some that have no shootings and then have a mass shooting that's really horrific. So if you think about Uvalde, Texas, this is a town of less than 20,000 people. They had this horrific mass school shooting, but prior to that, there was very little gun violence in that community. This isn't a small town where people are constantly engaged in gun violence. This was an episode that really spiked their numbers. And so there are different ways of trying to frame the problem and understand it. And like you said, political actors are going to talk about it in the way that, they want to score political points. And what I try to do with data, and I mean, we all have our personal lens and things that we think are important, but I really try to show that, when we talk about this phenomenon, here's how we measure it. Here's the data that we're using it. Here's the level that we're looking at. We're talking about a firearm homicide rate. Here's what this means. Here's what it's compared to. And then kind of thinking about, like, how do we understand, Chicago has a lot of gun violence, but what does that mean relative to other large cities? What does it mean relative to other countries and cities in other countries? And so I think that the more information that we have, the better we can get a sense of, like, the shared scope of gun violence, because right now, mass shootings do tend to happen. I mean, they happen with way more frequency than they ever used to. They happen more often in the United States than any other country, and they get a lot of attention, but then we're also kind of desensitized to them because it sometimes seems like they happen all the time. One of the things that I do, and I also have a Substack newsletter where I report gun violence trends, and it's free. And I show that mass shootings are way more common than most people realize, but most of them receive no news coverage if you operate under the definition of a mass shooting being an event where 3 or more people are shot or are murdered in a single event. But we have a vision of who a mass shooter is, and we think it's always, like, premeditated, and that it happens at, like, a certain type of place, like a school or a movie theater or a mall. But actually, there's tons of community gun violence that happens, during interpersonal disputes where there are mass victims. And this is happening all the time. And it's happening, with assault rifles, it's happening with handguns. So there's so many different forms of gun violence. So I think the nuance is something that I really want to add to the conversation, because it isn't just one type of problem. So one solution is not going to be a one size fits all for all the different manifestations of gun violence that we have. And I think you can actually build consensus around kind of like honing in on narrow things where you can get people to agree, like, hey, we're willing to support this type of policy to address this type of gun violence here. And maybe that's not the type of gun violence that's happening in another community that's as much of an issue. And so, yeah, I've learned a lot doing this because it's a pretty new area of research to me. And I think that it will be an important topic for many years to come.
Absolutely. And it's great that, you're talking about those kind of laboratories of democracy that these states are, and that maybe at the federal level, if we know that Congress has been very slow to act on many pieces of legislation, not just around gun violence, but things like after the Newtown shootings and at Sandy Hook, and how very little was done and the outrage that caused. But perhaps there were more things done, like in the state of Connecticut or in other states that have been impacted by this gun violence, and getting that type of research and getting those to those more local communities and policymakers may even have a larger impact than necessarily screaming into the void that might be the national conversation on something like this.
Yeah, I think that's why some of us like studying state politics, or at least I'll speak for myself, because it seems like the congressional inactivity is so frustrating. There's so few, big sweeping legislation that Congress passes, but the states are busy. They are so busy. They have been, passing gun control reforms and, expanding and retracting gun rights for decades. And that research really sheds a light on to just like how many different laws affect this issue. And and why federalism is so complicated, because guns don't stay within the border of the state where you obtain them. And this is something that in Illinois, our gun laws are, very different compared to some of our neighboring states, but there's no firm border. And so a lot of researchers point out that we can't, we can focus at the state level, but it really is a national phenomenon that we have to look at it from all these different levels of government and then also communities.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So you mentioned that you were working with a grad student. I want to talk about that experience for people that might be coming in as undergrads or potentially even considering our graduate program, and how you get to work sort of directly with a faculty member on that thesis or closure project that you do. Of course, there's comprehensive exams as well. I still remember very much my comprehensive exam experience and how that went through, and with at the time Dr. Miller chairing it and then Dr. Transu being on the committee as well, and kind of how their impact on they were able to use their areas of expertise to help guide what I was interested in, which was basically these special interest groups, independent political operations and organizations, those types of things that have become very prevalent over the last 10 years. And so it was kind of great to be able to work directly with faculty members. So can you talk to a prospective student about sort of the idea of working with faculty here at UIS directly?
Sure. Working with students is wonderful. There are different opportunities that students can have to work with faculty. So an undergraduate could get hired as a research assistant. That's an hourly paid position. Sometimes faculty members have some grants that we can use to hire a research assistant to collect data for us. And so this could be an undergrad. It could also be a graduate student. I've worked with both. And so I had a different graduate student that I worked with a couple years ago, and they were helping me to collect information from local law enforcement about their different firearm offenses that they had made arrests for or that were open cases. And they worked with me to compile a large database, and that was really useful for both me, and then they were able to use the research to do some of their own reporting and writing. And then, as you note, there's the closure exercise, and so students can write a traditional master's thesis. And in doing that research, a lot of times there'll be a faculty member who is interested in a topic that they want to kind of partner with their graduate student and produce research together. And so we might ask you to collect a certain part of the data as the research assistant, because, we have lots of different projects that we're working on at any given time as faculty members. So having help from a research assistant really enables us to do more. And so we'd say, collect this information. And then in the most recent example of my student, BJ Reddle, he was able to use this data that we had collected together to do an analysis for his thesis that was original. He collected, new data on the characteristics of communities that made them vulnerable to gun violence. And then he wrote up a really interesting paper about this that potentially, he could turn into something that could be submitted for publication or presented at a research conference. And so faculty and students here, both undergrads and grad students, frequently partner with students in research, and then they may present this research at conferences, and we support conference presentations for students. So there's usually funding that we can help assist with if you need to travel to a conference to pay for your registration or your hotel. So we really encourage it. And something that you said earlier that I think is important to underscore is we have faculty that do research in almost every main topic of political science. And we're really lucky because we have 10 faculty members. And so we do have someone that studies the courts or political theory or the states or Congress or the presidency, or, we've got somebody studying public opinion, somebody studying race and ethnicity and immigration. And so there's something for everyone. And this is something that you can get even though UIS is very small and you have small class sizes, but you do have a well-rounded faculty who are eager to work with our students.
Absolutely. And so that's one of the best parts about coming to a place that really puts teaching and research kind of at that forefront. We aren't necessarily an R1 institution where research is the prime directive. It's more a teaching focused environment, but certainly you all do your individual research and you've written your own books and you've written your own conference materials and gone and presented those. And then bringing students into that research is just a wonderful opportunity. Kind of coming to the end here, I want to ask you if there's anything that in particular you wanted to mention that I haven't asked you about today. And just to make sure that, if you have any particular prospective students listening or maybe current or alumni students as well, what messages you might have for them.
Absolutely. One would be to not hesitate to reach out to anybody on the faculty or myself if you have questions. Like Craig has mentioned, we are small. So, I don't have 1,000 students at any given time. If I'm teaching a class, I maybe have 20 students in that class at the most. And so you are really important for us to hear from. If you're a prospective student, we have students from all over the country and all over the world. If you drop an email and you say, I have questions about the program, can we Zoom or can we talk on the phone? I have time to talk to students. Like, this isn't like some faceless, nameless, huge institution where you might feel like you would get lost. I know my students very well. I know them by name. We have frequent meetings, and that's what is unique to us because we are a teaching focused institution, but the faculty have lots of expertise and we're really interested in sharing that with you. So reach out and ask us questions and somebody will be there immediately to give you the information that you seek.
That is just fantastic, and can't speak highly enough about the shared experience of the faculty here and the amount of knowledge that you all have, the diversity and research that you have. There's so many different facets and areas in political science as a whole, and it's great to be able to have faculty that are sort of involved in each of the different aspects of political science. And I can't wait to get to talk to the rest of your colleagues. So the plan is to sort of do at least monthly talk to one of your colleagues in the department to sort of get their research interest and be able to communicate that to potential students as well. But just really excited about the opportunity to get to speak to you today and just want to say thank you for your time.
You're welcome. And thank you so much.
What an excellent conversation. I was so excited to be able to talk to her about her particular research interest and working with students, and also just really want to make sure that we tell you again and again that there's a variety of different faculty here teaching in different areas throughout the realm of political science. And you're going to be able to get a little bit of everything or have a particular research interest. We will have a faculty member that we can pair you up, particularly at the graduate level when you're talking about things like comprehensive exams or a thesis as a closure project. That's something that you'll work directly with faculty on here at UIS. So if you are interested and you'd like to learn more about the program, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. So my email is dmcfa4@uis.edu, and you can find me there and send me an email that you're interested in the school and learning more. As I mentioned, this is going to be an ongoing series with our faculty. This is just the first of many, and so I'm excited to bring those to you at least once a month to talk about the faculty and their research interest and what really drives them and what inspired them to get involved in this field that is political science. So it's been a pleasure getting to talk to Dr. Wade today, and thank you so much for giving me your ear and listening to this show. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you need anything at all regarding the college here or UIS and the School of Politics and International Affairs. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.